They didn't expect you to stay. Not really. Somewhere in the back of their mind, behind the practiced silence and distant smiles, they had already prepared for you to leave. But when you finally did, you didn't leave with noise. You didn't slam doors, send long paragraphs, or beg them to see your worth. You left quietly, and it's that quiet that haunts them. Because you didn't just walk away. You disappeared into stillness. No more reaching out. No more asking what's wrong. No more trying to hold together something that kept slipping through your fingers. And now, the silence you left behind has become a mirror they can't turn away from. It speaks louder than every word you ever said. It lingers in the most unexpected moments. A song you once played in the car. An old photo they forgot to delete. A dream where your voice sounds clearer than anything they've heard in days. They told themselves you were too intense, too emotional, too much. But now they sit alone with one unshakable thought. You were the only one who ever saw them, and stayed anyway, until you didn't. And now, in the dark corners of their mind, something stirs. You were their calm when their world was chaos. You were the safety they never knew they needed until it was gone. But they didn't know how to hold it. They pushed you away to protect themselves from the very thing they craved. They told themselves they were better off alone. And now they are. Alone, with the memory of your presence echoing through the silence they thought they wanted. And this is the part no one talks about. Avoidants don't just forget. They suppress. They bury. They distract. But the body remembers. The nervous system remembers. And silence is a slow-burning reminder. You didn't come back. You didn't chase. You didn't fill the gap with chaos. You just became the lesson they never expected to learn. So here's the question we never ask out loud. Why is it the ones who walk away quietly that leave the loudest echoes in the avoidant mind? And why does love, the very thing they feared, haunt them the most when it's finally gone? You weren't just a chapter. You were the turning point. And they'll spend a lifetime rereading the lines they never said out loud. They never learned how to feel safe in closeness. Not because they were incapable, but because somewhere along the line, closeness started to mean danger. To the outside world, the avoidant seems calm, composed, emotionally regulated. But on the inside, their system is wired for self-protection. Because once upon a time, vulnerability led to abandonment. Or worse, to shame. So, their mind adapted. Don't need too much. Don't feel too deeply. Don't get used to anyone staying. This wasn't a conscious decision. This was survival. Some avoidants grew up with emotionally unavailable caregivers. Parents who praised independence but punished emotion. Others were met with inconsistency. Love one moment, rejection the next. So they learned to rely on the only person who felt safe, themselves. And here lies the root of the problem. Love feels unfamiliar. Nurturing feels intrusive. And genuine connection, the kind that requires you to be seen, feels unbearable. So when they met you, your emotional honesty threatened everything they'd built to stay safe. Not because you were wrong, but because you were real. You saw through their distance. You stayed through their withdrawal. And that made you dangerous, not in a harmful way, but in a transformative one. Carl Jung once said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls." The avoidance silence isn't just about you. It's about what you mirror back to them. Your presence confronted their deepest belief, that if someone really knew them, they'd leave. But you didn't. You stayed. You loved with depth. You gave without asking for performance. And that terrified them, because now they had something to lose. You were the opposite of what they expected. Instead of drama, you brought peace. Instead of chasing, you listened. Instead of demanding, you understood. And ironically, that's what made you feel unsafe. Why? Because avoidants aren't afraid of rejection. They're afraid of connection. Because connection activates every buried fear they've never fully faced. To feel safe, the avoidant needs distance. To feel loved, you needed closeness. You were both dancing in opposite directions, even if your hearts longed for the same thing. And the great tragedy? They often realize it after the silence. After you stopped explaining. After you stopped softening your truth. After you stopped pouring into someone who held their hands behind their back, afraid to receive. Their silence was meant to protect them. But your silence? It awakened something deeper. The problem isn't that they didn't care. It's that their nervous system couldn't tell the difference between love and danger. So they ran, not away from you, but away from the mirror you held up. This is where the psyche becomes a battlefield. Because now, in your absence, they're forced to sit with the very feelings they tried to avoid. Not just regret, but recognition. Not just longing, but loss. Not just sadness, but the unbearable ache of knowing. They pushed away the one person who offered the love they never believed they deserved. So the real question isn't why they distanced themselves. It's why they couldn't stay when everything they needed was finally within reach. That's the torment. Not that you left, but that you were real. And nothing hurts more than losing someone who gave you a glimpse of what healing could have felt like. Why it haunts them in silence doesn't hit them all at once. It trickles in. A smell, a song, an empty chair, a moment that would have been shared, but now echoes with absence. The avoidant doesn't mourn like you do. Their grief is delayed, repressed, buried beneath layers of logic and denial. But make no mistake, they feel it. It creeps in through silence. The very silence they once craved becomes the haunting they can't escape. You see, they told themselves a story, that you were too much, that they needed space, that closeness was suffocating. And in the moment, they believed it. Because for the avoidant, detachment feels like control. It's their defense against the unpredictable storm of real intimacy. But now the distance doesn't feel like peace. It feels like loss. This is the consequence they never prepared for. You no longer reach out. You no longer soften for them. You no longer wait for breadcrumbs of affection. You let go quietly, and that quiet is deafening. Carl Jung once wrote, "What you resist persists. What you avoid controls you." This is the avoidance dilemma. They avoided you, not because they didn't care, but because caring meant confronting their own emotional limitations. And now that you're gone, the reminders are everywhere, not in grand, cinematic ways, but in the subtleties they never expected to miss. They find themselves picking up their phone, then putting it down, staring at your name in old messages, wondering what it would feel like to hear your voice again. But they don't reach out, because the shame is louder than the longing. They remember how you looked at them, with patience, with depth, with hope. And they remember how they turned away. It doesn't just haunt them because they lost you. It haunts them because they never allowed themselves to receive you. And now they replay it, not like a movie they loved, but like a moment they failed. This is the haunting. They realize they were loved in a way they may never find again. Not because you were perfect, but because you were present. You stayed when they were distant. You held space when they were silent. You gave them room, and they mistook that room for permission to let you go. Now, your absence has become the teacher. The quiet nights don't feel free. They feel hollow. The peace they once defended feels like exile. The space they demanded feels like punishment. They scroll through others, trying to replicate what you gave. But it doesn't work. Because connection isn't replaceable. Because your energy, your depth, your empathy, your soul left an imprint that cannot be mimicked. This is what the world doesn't see. The avoidant isn't cold. They're fractured, not heartless, just scared. And now that you're gone, they face a truth they've never had to admit. They pushed away the one person who made them feel safe enough to unlearn their patterns. But healing doesn't come from regret alone. It comes from transformation. And some avoidants do wake up, but only when the reminders no longer come from you. They come from within. It's the laugh that no longer fills their space, the emotional attunement they can't find elsewhere, the softness they once rolled their eyes at, now felt as sacred. And here's the final twist. You became their mirror, and now, in your absence, they're left staring at their own reflection, unfiltered, undeniable, and echoing with what could have been. Why your silence is what shifts the dynamic. You didn't scream. You didn't beg. You didn't send one last message to explain what they failed to see. You simply went silent. And for someone with an avoidant attachment style, that silence is the one thing they can't fully control. They expected protest. They expected you to hold the emotional weight like you always did, to bridge the distance, to decode their mixed signals, to love them through the shutdowns, the excuses, the "I'm just not ready" speeches. But when you didn't, something shifted, not just in the dynamic, but in them. Because the moment you stopped fighting for connection, you did the very thing they've unconsciously feared all along. You mirrored their own detachment. You handed them the echo of their own emotional absence. And suddenly, it wasn't comforting. It was piercing. They always believed they had time, that you'd stay despite it all, that you'd reach across the silence, again and again, because you always had. But then came the moment when your silence wasn't temporary. It wasn't a strategy. It wasn't a ploy to get a reaction. It was a boundary. And that is where everything began to unravel for them. Because the avoidant may resist intimacy, but they're terrified of being truly alone. They want connection. They just want it on their terms. Safe, distant, manageable. But when you walked away without punishing them, when you removed your energy without making it a spectacle, when you stopped explaining and simply let go, you disrupted the pattern. Carl Jung once said, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." And that's what your silence became. A painful awakening. A confrontation with the truth they had been avoiding all along. That love, real love, cannot survive in avoidance. You see, your silence didn't come from bitterness. It came from clarity. It wasn't about making them miss you. It was about no longer abandoning yourself. You stopped overfunctioning, stopped proving your worth, stopped bleeding emotionally in hopes they'd finally choose you. And in that moment, you chose yourself. That is the rebellion, the quiet, internal revolution that happens when someone with a deeply giving heart finally says, "Enough." And here's the paradox that rattles the avoidant to their core. Your silence feels louder than any words you ever spoke, because it speaks to what they once believed was impossible, that you could love them and still leave. They may not say it, they may not show it, but your absence is not neutral. It confronts them. It challenges their self-story. It questions the very foundation of how they relate to love. Because for the first time, they're the one left wondering, what happened to the one who used to care so deeply? What if that was their one real shot at love? What if no one else will ever see them the way you did and still stay? They may not reach out. They may scroll through your social media in silence. They may talk about you vaguely to others. But the dynamic has shifted because now they carry the discomfort. Now they're the ones sitting in emotional limbo. This is what real change looks like. Not manipulation, Not games, not punishment, but energetic withdrawal from a place of self-worth. It's not about making them come back. It's about making yourself whole. And in that wholeness, you become untouchable, not because you're cold, but because you're no longer available to people who cannot meet you with the same emotional depth. Your silence is not empty. It is full of wisdom. It says everything they refused to hear when you were still speaking. And whether they admit it or not, they hear it now. What they remember long after you're gone, long after the last message fades, long after the conversations stop replaying in their head, long after they pretend they've moved on. Something stays. It's not your photos, not your voice, not even your laughter echoing through their memory. It's what you represented. Because you weren't just another person who came and went. You were a mirror, a witness to the parts of them they tried to hide, the vulnerability behind the detachment, the tenderness buried beneath their independence, the silent ache for intimacy they couldn't fully admit. And when you finally went quiet, you didn't just leave a space. You left a contrast between the connection you offered and the emptiness they now sit with, a contrast between the warmth of your emotional availability and the cold armor they still wear, a contrast between the way you saw them and the way they struggled to see themselves. Carl Jung once wrote, "We meet ourselves time and again in 1,000 disguises on the path of life." And that's what begins to haunt the avoidant. Not your absence, but the reflection you leave behind, the version of themselves they could have become, if only they had allowed the connection to deepen. You see, avoidants often mistake emotional safety for danger. They flinch at softness. They pull away from presence. Because deep down, they were once taught that closeness means losing control, or worse, losing themselves. But when someone like you enters their life, someone who loves without possession, who stays without smothering, who speaks from the soul and listens with the heart, it disrupts everything they've come to believe about love. They may push you away, but they never forget you. Not because you made them chase you, not because you played a role, but because you showed them what love could have been, if they were ready. And that's the truth that lingers. Long after you stop reaching out, long after they convince themselves they're fine, they remember the way your words slowed their nervous system, the way your presence made silence feel safe, the way your empathy made them feel seen, even when they didn't speak, the way you didn't demand anything, and yet deserved everything. You were the invitation to evolve, to move from avoidance into intimacy, to choose courage over comfort. And even if they couldn't accept it then, they will always remember what they turned down, not in bitterness, but in quiet moments, when the mask slips, when they're alone, when the next relationship doesn't offer that same resonance, when they feel the space you once filled, not with noise, but with meaning. You were a chapter they didn't know how to read, but they can't stop rereading the lines in hindsight. And that's what haunts them. Not you, but the version of themselves they were too afraid to become while you were still there. So if you've been questioning your silence, if you've wondered whether it mattered, if you've doubted whether they ever really felt your absence, know this: they don't miss you because you disappeared. They miss you because you showed up in ways they couldn't. And when you finally stopped, they had to face the echo of their own emptiness. This is not about revenge. This is not about waiting for them to wake up. This is about reclaiming your wholeness, knowing that you offered something sacred, and walking forward with the quiet power of someone who no longer needs to be understood to be at peace. You became the reminder, the symbol, the lesson, the one they didn't realize they needed until it was too late. And that is your liberation. If this message found you at the edge of letting go, or at the beginning of your own healing journey, don't turn back. Your silence is not emptiness. It is sacred space. Let it echo with truth. Let it lead you home to yourself. And if you felt seen by this, subscribe for more reflections like this. Because the ones who love deeply must also learn to love themselves even deeper.